Hey guys, I was at my first Pariah Nexus tournament this weekend and I was very fortunate to be able to take first place, and now I'd like to share my top 10 changes to how the game works that you absolutely positively need to know about if you want to win in Pariah Nexus. So without further ado, let's dive right in. It's almost a consensus in the community that this is the 10.5 edition almost, and the first change I want to talk about is deployment. Some of the deployment zones have changed and they're very interesting now, offering us more dynamic deployment options. Thanks to that staggered central zone we have on the tipping point and sweeping engagement deployment maps, we are actually now capable of starting much closer to the opponent than we could previously. Only 16 inches away, which is even closer than the old search and destroy that is 18 inches. Dawn of War now goes 12 inches deep into the map, unlike 10 inches that it was before, which again makes us closer to each other. And now it's not 24 inches apart that we are now only 20 inches apart. Most terrain layouts, like for example layout 6 from the Tournament Compendium, there is a very good staging zone that is very close to that central sharp edge where you can put your melee assets. Want to start the game obviously as close as possible to your opponent. It's quite obviously a strong advantage for the melee armies, which want to close the distance as soon as possible. It does mean, however, that your opponents will also be able to utilize that, and be careful because you never know who goes first. So if you put something very important in that sharp corner and then your opponent rolls well on something like their advance, maybe they have advance in charge, or they have out deployed you, so you've put something important in that corner and then they had their drop and they dropped something that is faster and is more likely to reach you, you can be in a lot of trouble. So be careful with that, position yourself close to your opponent. Titanic models now trigger your opponent to do an extra drop, meaning that if you have 3 big knights in your army, you essentially have 3 more models or units to deploy virtually. So your opponent has less information when you're deploying big knights than they used to have, which is a good thing because big knights always need more help. Redeploys are now fixed to a specific point before the game starts, so it doesn't matter if you had the good redeploy quote-unquote or the bad one, all redeploys now happen at that stage, which is probably a good thing for the game. However, it makes the granularity of how redeploys work much less interesting. I really like the fact that some detachments like the Crute or Turned Vanguard had the ability to redeploy in a cool way, meaning that you deploy your most important units and then you can, after you know who goes first, either keep them in the open or remove them and save them, hide them somewhere. Or decreased in price, so Castellan's Mark from the Shield Host detachment with Custodes or the Vanguard Onslaught, Neuronode, they both have been discounted, so now they cost less, which is a good thing, of course. Overall, I do like the new deployments, and I like that they are favoring just a very slightly bit melee armies, because I think melee armies need help. Compared to something like a fast shooty army, they will almost always be on the back foot, so having that deployment helping us, even if that just tiny bit, is very appreciated. Fixed versus tactical. So the fixed mission deck has lost the recovery assets, which is the new secondary objective that was in the, or is currently in the Pariah Nexus deck. However, it was removed from the competitive compendium, so you can no longer take it as your fixed mission. You still can draw it as your tactical one, of course. It was a very powerful one, allowing you to essentially do an action in your deployment zone and just out of your deployment zone with something like a lone up unit, which is very easy and it's extremely easy to score. So it became for a very short while the best secondary to take as fixed, and then you would pick your second one depending on what you're playing against. Bring it down, call the horde, or something else. Now that it's gone, it's much harder for you to play fixed. Fixed is much less guaranteed in terms of points and harder in terms of overall strategy in the game. You still can go for the old combination of deploy teleport homer, which is now called established locus, and behind enemy lines. However, you need to be seriously mobile. I mean, like Grey Knights level of mobility to be able to reliably score those. And me as a Grey Knights player, I would personally never go for that. I would almost always go for tactical no matter what, even if I have those many 75-point characters that I can throw into my opponent's backline turn after turn. I just don't want my opponent to know exactly what I'm going to be doing. I want his brain cells to be occupied thinking about too many things and making mistakes, because ultimately mistakes are how you win in games against great opponents. Everyone makes them, and if you are able to capitalize on something that your opponent did, that's usually what tips the game into something that cannot be recovered by your opponent. You can now pay 1 CP for New Order's card, so getting an extra card instead of the one you've drawn multiple times. It makes it much easier for you to get a good card. You're not going to be stuck with the same one every turn. I think it's a very good change because we have very few CP, so if you are in such a situation where you think that spending multiple CPs to get a card is worth it, I think you should have that ability. Most secondary missions now have much more ergonomic quote-unquote conditions for you to discard or reshuffle the card. So if you've drawn Bring It Down and there's no vehicle in your opponent's army on the table, you're not forced to keep that card until the end of your turn, and you can reshuffle it back into the deck, which is very good, or in this case you'll discard it actually. It feels much better now. There are less of those feel bad moments when you just cannot score anything, or there's a card that you want to keep, like for example the Storm Hostile objective that you cannot score in turn 1, but you now can keep it until turn 2 and then score it, where before you were forced to reshuffle it. I really like how they treated secondary cards in this iteration of the rules. It feels much better playing them. As always, I want to remind you about my Patreon 40K coaching service. If you're looking for help building your competitive rosters, preparing you for tournaments, or have any questions about your collection in general, check out the links for my Patreon in the description. Thank you. Next is Battle Line and Secret Missions. So from the competitive compendium, it is very, very clear that GW wants us to use Battle Line as much as possible. It is a separate topic of how many Battle Line choices you want. In short, I think that you should not try to make your army Battle Line focused unless it was already that. So for example, my Grey Knights, I am running Strike Marines, I'm running Terminators, so they're all Battle Line and I don't need to change anything. It's just a nice bonus for me. But if you're playing Space Marines where you don't really have great Battle Line choices apart from a couple, which I'm going to make a separate video about later, then you really don't want to run 3 units of 5 Assault Intercessors just because of the Battle Line keyword. There is not enough incentive for that. However, there is incentive to have some, so here it is. 13 missions out of 20 that are in the competitive compendium, so those are the pool of missions that your TOs will be picking out from when running Grand Tournaments, RTTs, or any tournament whatsoever. 13 missions out of 20 will have Battle Line focused mission rules in them, so meaning that Battle Line will be getting some sort of buff in more than half of the missions you're going to be playing in your tournaments or even in your local gaming club if you're going to be using those rules, which I recommend to do that. 3 times you'll be able to advance, fall back, and do actions with your Battle Line. 3 times in 3 missions, I mean, you'll get 1 victory point extra once per game for every objective marker that you get your Battle Line on. That's raised banners. 3 times, so 3 missions will have Battle Line that can shoot or be in combat, be in engagement range, and action, which can be quite game-changing, especially for those Battle Line units that are quite good at shooting, or very big Battle Line units like a Brick of Terminators in Grey Knights case. In 2 missions, your Battle Line can use Go to Ground stratagem, which is get cover and get 6+ invulnerable safe. It's quite a specific one, not really that important considering cover is almost always available now in 10th edition, but still it's nice to have that for 0 CP. And 2 times your Battle Line can get out of Strat Reserves turn 1, that is up to 200 points for Strike Force. That can be a useful thing, however, are forced to deploy within the edge, so even if your Battle Line has Deep Strike, which some of them have, like for example the Custodian Guard squad, which the 4-man Custodian Guard squad is precisely 200 points, so you could have run them and deep strike somewhere closer to your opponent, but then now you have to be within 6 inches of the edge, so it's not that useful. It's a nice rule, you can implement that tactically, but it's not something I would again try to build your list around, because it's only 2 times that you're going to encounter that out of all 20 missions. Also do need 1 Battle Line unit, in my opinion, to prevent your opponent from an easy score of 20 points in the War of Attrition secret mission. It's the mission where your opponent gets 20 points if they have a Battle Line unit in your deployment zone and all of your Battle Line units are either dead or are inside the deployment zone, your deployment zone that is. Or if you have a Battle Line unit that is not in your deployment zone, you automatically prevent your opponent from scoring this particular secret mission. If you also can get that same Battle Line unit to hold on to any objective marker in no man's land for turn 4 and 5, you're essentially preventing your opponent from using the 2 out of 3 practical secret missions available. So the second one, where you need to control 3 objectives in no man's land, that's also gone for them. It will obviously be very useful to also have a fast warlord nowadays, because that's the 3rd practical secret mission, where you need to get your warlord onto the deployment zone objective of your opponent. And interestingly enough, it doesn't say that you need to control it, so you just need your warlord to be on that objective. So something like Jump Pack Captain or Magnus or Drago with a squad of Brotherhood Terminators. I cannot stop referencing Grey Knights, I just love them so much. Those units are very powerful and very nice to have as an option for your secret missions in case you get low on primary during the game. Next is the Immortal Wounds and Devastating Wounds change. Devastating Wounds are now back to being Mortal Wounds as they were in the very beginning of 10th edition. The only difference is still they don't spill over like Mortal Wounds can. That is a very positive change for a lot of those rules that help you mitigate mortal wounds in some fashion, usually by means of Feel No Pain. Suddenly, those things like 4+ Feel No Pain from Genetic Alchemy for Custodes, or Terminator Chaplain's rule, or Watchers in the Dark for the Dark Angels are much more useful, because they are giving you a 4+ Feel No Pain against multiple types of attacks, not just mortal wounds, which are not as numerous in the game now. Devastating wounds are quite numerous. They've also clarified that mortal wounds need to be allocated to bodyguard models in the unit first, so just like any normal attacks, which helps prevent those weird interactions where some people had characters walking with just a couple of wounds on them all game, whilst some models in their units were receiving damage. It is a good, simplified, not simple approach that we were promised in the beginning of 10th, and I think it's a very good step in the right direction. Now the big models moving. I was waiting for this change for a long time, and I'm so happy to see it, because I love playing huge big monstrosities on the tabletop, but you're always punished if you're trying to play them on competitive tables, because ruins are very close to one another, and now this has been fixed. So models can now shrink to the size of their base when passing through those terrain features, and then they expand back into their normal size. That makes the interaction between these big models and terrain features much cleaner, and will cause less problems for you during tournaments, because sometimes when you ran those huge things and the game was quite heated up, your opponents really like to make it hard for you to move through those ruins by trying to argue about each millimeter of your movement, which I understand you're trying to win the game. I fully understand, but I'm happy that this has been fixed, and now there is no point in arguing about that. Things like Bloodthirsters with huge wings, especially like the Bloodthirsters I have, which are 3D printed, even bigger than the normal Bloodthirster model that GW carry. Mutalith Vortex Beast for 1000 Suns, which are extremely good models, even with them being big. Now that they're easier to move, it's even better. Horror Specs for Tyranids was model that was absolutely unusable, and now it is usable. Board Defiler unfortunately doesn't have a base as far as I understand, so it will not help in, but everything else is in a much better spot now. Knights have specifically received an ability to move through ruins if they want to, ruins that are taller than 4 inches, but they can become battle shocked on a roll over once if you're unlucky. That is a very powerful change, because they used to struggle a lot when they were trying to clear a ruin, and sometimes being battle shocked is going to be more than worth it, especially if it's just 16% chance, compared to trying to clear a ruin across several turns, which was very possible for knights. And also move within engagement range of enemy units, just not end the move there, so again making it easier for you to move those big knights. Considering at how big of a disadvantage they usually are in games, it's a good change, and I like it, because Chaos Knights maybe, just maybe, will have a reason to run more of the big ones. And also have your model's parts overhang, just the parts, not the base, overhang the battlefield edge. However, you cannot use those parts to draw a line of sight to your opponent, but your opponent will be able to draw a line of sight to those parts. So that is a slight punishment for just using more of the board than there is. However, it is good still, because sometimes it was very tight to fit your models again during deployment tournament, for example, near the edge of the board without taking a lot of space and then moving your other units around. Gilliman and Lion can now both move through ruins like normal infantry models, which is an absolutely must-have change, and I'm so glad they've done that, because they are human, so they have hands, they can crawl through windows even if they're very big, or worst case scenario, they can just smash through a window, which I think they are more than capable of doing. Flimsy door will not stop Lion from walking through it, so I am glad they've changed it, and now both of these Primarchs are much better as competitive choices in my opinion. Same happened to Belisarius Cole, along with some other changes for his stat line in AdMech, so hopefully AdMech players are happy with him. Continuing the topic of moving models, we now have the thing called pivoting, so essentially we can rotate models around our base according to the rules that are in the pivoting section, which means essentially that if you have a round base, you can pivot for free as much as you want. It doesn't matter if you are a very long model, very wide, you just pivot around as much as you want, meaning that you will essentially get extra inches to your movement, which you usually got anyways because no one was really moving models properly ever. If you ever played in a tournament and you've played against someone like playing, I don't know, Drukhari or Knights or Land Raiders, you almost always had to just ignore the fact that they are simply adding inches to their movement, and I never was really angry about that too much because I understand the pain of having this huge model and trying to move it at least something that looks like a decent amount of inches. However, I'm glad now that those people will not have to break the rules to move properly. If you are not a circle base, if you're an oval base, or if you don't have a base, you just pay 2 inches from your movement, and then you can pivot a limitless amount of times within that move. It's a very good change, especially for something like a Land Raider that used to lose a bunch of inches rotating around its axis. Now it doesn't have to. You can even pivot multiple times during your movement, so you can pivot, then move in a straight line, then pivot again, and that's all one pivot. You don't have to pay 2 inches multiple times. Makes tanks much better and much cleaner to use, and I'm very happy about it. There's just a slight rules problem now where units like, for example, Drukhari Raider that has a circular base, so it has the pivot value of 0, so it doesn't have to pay anything for pivoting. It can be deep struck, and then when you declare a charge, you measure the distance. You are outside of 9 inches with every part of your model, but then you do a free pivot for 3 inches, and then you are like 3 inches closer to your opponent, and then you just need to roll, what, 6-inch charge or something like that. So that will obviously be fixed very soon. I suggest you don't even pay attention to that. Please don't try to build tanks in accordance to this rule, because that's not how GW intended, and they will fix it very soon. So just sit tight, and this will not be in the game for a long time. One thing is definitely clear: vehicles are now better than they were, and they were pretty damn good already. So get painting those impulsors, transports, tanks, etc. Now the lone ops change. So they have changed mostly in a good way. Non-shooting attacks like Doombolt and Vortex of Doom cannot snipe the lone ops anymore, which I think is a good change, though I hate those Eldar lone ops, and I really loved sniping them with my librarian, but alas, I will have to find another way. And yeah, Grey Knights are probably the army that is most easily can actually get within 12 inches of the lone up anyway, so I should not complain. For Thousand Suns, it's a very big difference, because they used to be able to just double up their distance with a Doombolt, and they're like, oh, here is a lone up 36 inches away, now it's dead. Now you cannot do that, and that is probably a good thing. Find it funny that I think they've actually missed the fact that Typhus has the same ability, and he still, as far as I can again see from rules as written, can still snipe out lone ops as is, but probably it will be fixed very soon, or maybe I've just missed some point in the rules. Lone op stratagems, so something that gave you a lone op like rule, have been reworked to only give you 18-inch lone op always instead of 12 inches. This has affected Tyranids Vanguard, where you had that stratagem for 1 CP. Grey Knights, Hallowed, and Soulfire is just very bad now. I've never used it in any of my games, I must say. Maybe like Yeah, I've used them once, really once out of all of my games for 2 command points. Now I will not use it ever because, like, why would you? And most importantly, the Canoptic Court stratagem was nerfed, and that one is very good because I've played against Canoptic Court in tournaments, and that is not a nice thing to play against, because when you move closer to them within 9 inches, they can move away, and then they can activate the 12-inch lone up, and then you cannot shoot them, and then they charge back at you, and it's torture. I think for the specifically sneaky armies like the Vanguard, they could have left this one intact, but they probably just caught shrapnel from the Necrons, so that sometimes happens with 40k. Now that there are more actions in the game and scoring is generally harder overall, I think that is much better to have a couple of lone ups running around, and those armies that don't have access to any of them, unfortunately, will be at a disadvantage, like the Leagues of Votan don't have a lone up for now. I hope they will get one in the future. Next is a very good change. It's the change to indirect fire. It's very simple now. All indirect fire misses on 1, 2, and 3, regardless of any rules. +1 to hit, ignore modifiers, anything that you might have. And I'm sorry, but I'm not sorry. And guard players, you just need to learn how to play your army in other way. And I know guard players that like to play it in a cool way, which is a bunch of tanks, Lehman Russes, Chimeras, with a bunch of infantry, Bulgarian, things like that. That is at least playing 40k the 40k way, where parking 15 indirect fire manticores and basilisks in your deployment zone and just firing away, it is not fun for anyone, maybe for you, but not for people playing against you. So I'm happy that indirect fire is no longer this deadly. Indirect is okay when it's a tamed rule, so it was pretty good in 9th edition. I like to have that as a sort of flavor choice. For example, with the Imperial Knights rockets on top, you may finish off like a 2-man scout squad sometimes with a couple of those missiles. You're like, oh, cool, they were hidden, but now I killed them. That is okay. That's how the indirect should work. It should not be able to kill half a unit of your elite infantry, which is staging behind a ruin hoping for a charge. That's not how it should work. I'm glad they caught up with this, and now it will most likely be in a reasonable spot for a while. Next is stratagems and the vect, which is the term for all things that make stratagems more expensive, all the abilities that make them more expensive. There are a lot of changes here. Grenades cannot be thrown now after falling back or advancing, even if you have assault or can fall back and shoot. Grenade was very often used in those situations where you end up very close to your opponent. Say you have charged someone, you have not finished them off, now you need to fall back, but you want to finish them off without wasting or sacrificing some of your shooting. Then you pay a CP, you throw a grenade, and you do an average of 3 mortal wounds, which sometimes is enough to finish off the tank. Now you cannot do that when you fall back, even if you can shoot and fall back, which I don't know how I feel about that, because I did not feel that grenade was an overpowered rule. It probably is fair considering that not all armies have access to grenades, so things like Tyranids never used grenades, or Tank Shock for that matter. As a Space Marine player, I feel slightly underwhelmed. Next is Tank Shock, and now it's giving you a dice to roll, or number of dice to roll, in accordance with your toughness, not your strength. So if you're toughness 12, you roll 12 dice, and not because you have strength 12. You don't get +2 to those dice for having higher toughness than your target, which is also a new thing, and it's very good for the Land Raider, which is toughness 12, and it's bad for small vehicles that used to have melee weapons, like Invictor, for example, which is lower toughness but has, for some weird reason, strength 14 fist, so you could have rolled 16 dice and usually have done like 5 or 6 mortal wounds on average. Now it's a less valuable stratagem overall, and it's better for those higher toughness vehicles, which is what it's supposed to be. It's Tank Shock, not Dreadnought Shock. Stratagems that are regenerating units are now once per game, which I think is very good, because playing against the same unit of Gargoyles, or the same unit of Kassakin, or the same unit of Tyranids Endless Multitude was not that fun, though I think for the Endless Swarm detachment it's a big blow, and I hope they will think about a way to make it more playable now that it was really hurt by the Cull the Horde and this change to the regen CP. Heroic Intervention is now 1 CP, and it's an extremely powerful stratagem that you really need to take seriously, or it will bite you at the very wrong moment. You need to learn it, you need to keep it in mind always, especially if you're playing a melee army. And CP reroll can now be fast rolled. So for all those guys that like to say, oh, you need to roll slowly because, well, you will have more information. Yes, you're right, but everyone played 40K like this for like decades, and I'm glad that now it's enshrined in rules, and that's how it was always supposed to be, and that's how I always played, and I'm glad that everyone should be playing like this from now on. Captains cannot double dip into stratagems now, but they can discount any stratagem by 1 whatsoever instead of just battle tactics. If you had a bunch of good battle tactics stratagems, it's not great because you like to double dip into them. If you didn't have good battle tactics, if you had a bunch of epic deeds and war gear strats that you wanted to use, now is the perfect time because your captains can access that, and overall I think it's a good change. All Vect abilities are now much more powerful and completely different. So before, it used to be your opponent used a stratagem somewhere during the game, and then the next use of that stratagem was +1 cost until the end of the game. It was a quite powerful ability when it was used against battle tactic stratagems that were something that your opponent liked to use over and over again, preferably in multiple phases. However, now it's a much more powerful one because it's an aura of 12 inches, and any opponent's unit that is within 12 inches of that model, when they are using any stratagem from the first try, so automatically it will cost more CP by 1. So if your opponent is a melee army and they like to rush into you and then use 1 CP for, I don't know, +1 to wound and 1 CP for something else, they will have to spend more CP for that, meaning that all those Vect abilities are now a great deterrent against melee armies, which I'm not sure if melee armies needed more problems in this edition, but now they have them. Very good for Watchmaster for Death Watch, and Bjorn the Fell-Handed is just an absolute crazy model now. Lastly, actions. So now that 4 out of 9 primary missions have actions tied to them, though Unexploded Ordnance only appears in 1 of 20 competitive missions, so we should not probably count it. And now that actions are formally enshrined into being a part of the game again, and now you cannot advance, fall back, and do actions, and cannot have OC 0 and do actions. Yes, even if you have Assault, or even if you fall back and shoot. It is extremely important to have more units that are capable of performing those actions for you without hindering your damage output. Or something cheap, something that has OC, which is very important, preferably small enough to hide behind ruins and can actually walk through them, and most importantly is naturally fast. Now that you no longer can advance to the point where you need to have and perform an action, you need to be very careful with how you position those units, and having extra movement on them is going to help. As mentioned before, it's harder to score big now, so adapting to these changes will be crucial for your success, especially early on in Pariah Nexus, whilst everyone is learning how to really play this game. For Space Wolves, for example, there's less argument now for running a bunch of Wolf, and especially considering they're more expensive now. I think like 10 points or 5 points more expensive, so enough more expensive that you would think about them anyways, and now they're OC 0, they cannot do actions, it's even less interesting. Wolf and Dreadnought, the same story, even though I think Wolf and Dreadnought is so good with its mortal wound output, especially considering that now we are gonna lack that with Tank Shock. I think that it still is a good unit. It's even more important now to have the Chaplain saturation for your Death Company heavy list, so that every time your Death Company wants to perhaps do an action, you have a Chaplain within 12 inches. Jump back Intercessors seem to be absolutely meant for action work in your list now, and perhaps even more important than Scouts because they have that natural on-the-ground mobility that the Scouts don't have. Scouts have Scout and Infiltrate, so they can get to a point on the board very quickly. However, once they are there, they're not really mobile, considering that they have lost their ability to advance an action, where the Assault Intercessors, they just naturally moved more, 6 inches more, so they will be able to get much further, plus they are much better in combat. These are the top 10 changes I really wanted you to know about, because I felt during my games with Pariah Nexus that I really was surprised by some of them, and they really meant a difference for winning or losing a game. Let me know if I missed something important. There's much more content coming for Pariah Nexus, so stay tuned. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.